You know, there are some spots in this world that just don't feel right. Old homes where the shadows settle in a little too deep, like they've taken root, and where time itself seems to get all twisted up, snaring anyone inside. Well, let me tell you, the Fenmore Estate is that kind of place. It's this huge, sprawling Victorian mansion sitting way out on the edge of our quiet little town, and it's been wrapped in a blanket of silence and weird rumors for the last 100 years. The family who lived there, the Fenmores, they had one rule they never, ever broke. After the sun went down, not a single one of them would set foot outside, not even once. Folks around here say it wasn't always like that. They remember a time when the Fenmores were just like anybody else. You'd hear the sound of kids playing in that big garden, see carriages pulling up for fancy dinners, and laughter would just pour out of the open windows. But then, something shifted. The moment that sun started to sink below the tree line, everything changed. It was like a switch flipped. Those big iron gates would slam shut all on their own. Every curtain in the place would get yanked closed, and the whole house would go dead quiet. I mean, an unnatural kind of quiet. No lamplight glowing behind the windows, no voices carrying on the wind, nothing. They didn't pack up and move away. They just vanished from the world while still being right there inside those walls. They were prisoners in their own home. Now, what in God's creation could make a whole family choose to live like that only in the daylight? Pure fear. Did they all just lose their minds? Or was it something else? Something a whole lot darker. The old stories that get passed around, the local legends, they talk about an ancient curse, something that's been handed down from parent to child, a binding agreement made generations back to shield the family from some unspeakable horror that lives in the darkness outside. I've heard some folks say it was a witch's doing, others mutter about something even older. The real truth, though, is all knotted up with fear, secrets, and a raw, desperate need to just make it to the next sunrise. The whole terrible story for the Fenmore family starts back in the early 1900s with the man of the house, Elias Fenmore. He came back from what he called a mysterious expedition way out deep in the untouched parts of the Appalachian wilderness. He didn't just bring back curiosities or stories. He carried a secret back with him, a dark one that would rewrite his family's future for good. Not long after he got home, strange symbols started showing up, carved right into the walls of the mansion. Then came the noises, weird, unexplained sounds that would echo down the halls right at twilight. It only took a few months for the family to lay down the law, an unspoken rule everyone had to follow. Once the sun was down, nobody was to step outside, ever. The kids were warned about the darkness out there. The hired help all disappeared one after another, and eventually people just stopped visiting altogether. As the years rolled on, the neighbors only ever talked about the Fenmore place in low, hushed voices. They called it the Fenmore's curse. See, Elias Fenmore was a man driven by curiosity and a big ambition. He was a wealthy industrialist, but he had a powerful hunger for digging into things that were best left unknown. He was always banklining trips into forgotten corners of the world. Then, in the spring of 1902, he led his own private team deep into the heart of the Appalachian wilderness, so far out there they were beyond any map or town. Him and his men were looking for ancient relics, stories told in whispers, and secrets buried under miles of dense forest. What Elias actually found out there, well, nobody who wasn't on that trip can really say they understand it. The few reports that exist mention weird symbols scratched into the walls of caves, old altars that didn't belong to any faith we know, and this creepy, deep silence where you wouldn't even hear a single bird. Some of his journals, the ones they found later, have these vague, scary notes in them. They mention a watcher in the dark, blood owed to the earth, and warnings ignored. When Elias finally did come home, he was a changed man. The light in his eyes was gone, replaced by shadows nobody recognized. His housekeeper said the whole manor felt colder afterwards, and those strange noises would start up every evening as the light faded. Worst of all, Elias himself started carving these bizarre symbols into the wooden walls of his own home. They were like nothing anyone had ever seen, and some folks swore they seemed to squirm and pulse if you looked at them under a flickering lamp. It wasn't long before the whole family started seeing and hearing things they couldn't explain. The youngest daughter, Lillian, started talking about a dark man who would show up in her room at dusk. She said he'd whisper secrets to her in a voice so cold it would freeze your blood. The family dog outright refused to go outside after dark and would just bark and bark at empty corners inside the house. Servants quit their jobs without giving a reason, and soon enough, guests just stopped coming over entirely. A local historian who dug into the Fenmore family tree later on uncovered something downright terrifying. He thought that Elias had accidentally messed with an ancient pact, some kind of curse tied to the very land and to his own bloodline. Those symbols he was carving everywhere, they weren't just for show, they were seals, meant to keep something terrible locked away. Or maybe they were meant to chain the family itself to a promise there was no breaking. This curse demanded complete obedience. The Fenmores could never, ever step outside after sunset. If they did, it would mean a horrible end, not just for them, but for everyone they cared about. And so, that's the rule they lived by. Their entire world got smaller and smaller with every night that passed. But it always made you wonder, what was it that waited out there in the darkness, the thing the Fenmores were so deathly afraid of? The whispers in town told of a shadowy figure seen wandering the woods around the property, a thing that hunted for souls lost in the night. Some said it was the ghost of a woman who'd been wronged, and others believed it was something much older, a primeval force that was here long before any of us. Whatever it was, the price the Fenmores paid for their safety was their freedom. They were exiles inside their own home, prisoners from twilight till dawn. The tale of Elias Fenmore's trip is really just the first page of a long, dark family story. After he came back from that fateful journey, the world for the Fenmores shrank down to just the walls of their mansion. It was a grand place, sure, but it became a cage, a suffocating one. As the sun started to dip down every single day, the family would get ready for a ritual they had to perform to survive. It was unlike anything you've ever heard of. They'd pull all the curtains tight well before dusk, shutter every window to block out the creeping dark, and put out all the lamps except for these weird clusters of candles they'd set up all over the house, arranged in these strange, arcane patterns. The whole family would gather in the biggest parlor, an old room that folks whispered used to be a private chapel. The air in there was always thick with a silence that felt heavy, like it was pressing right down on your skin. Outside, the world just kept on turning, completely unaware. Kids played in the streets, neighbors sat on their porches and talked, but past the estate's gates, it was like an invisible wall went up, cutting the Fenmores off from the night completely. Years went by, and that rule was never broken. Nobody crossed that line once the sun was down. People who did try were said to just vanish into thin air. There's a story about the family's oldest son, Thomas, how he once tried to defy the rule. He stepped out into the garden as twilight was falling, and he never came back inside. All they ever found of him was his shattered lantern lying in a patch of thorny bushes. Inside that mansion, time didn't seem to work right. Days and nights just blurred together under the heavy weight of all that fear. The Fenmores themselves grew pale and fragile-looking, their skin turning almost see-through from never getting fresh air or real sunlight. But their eyes had this haunted, intense look to them, like they were always watching something you couldn't see. Even stranger were the rituals they'd perform in the dark. There were chants in languages nobody speaks anymore, little offerings left on an altar down in the basement, and letters written in shaky handwriting that were sealed up tight, never to be mailed but kept locked away. The local stories tell of quick glimpses people would get, a figure pacing behind a frosted glass window, the flicker of candlelight throwing crazy shadows on the old wallpaper, and this low hum, like some forgotten lullaby that would echo through the halls after dark. The Fenmore estate turned into a ghost of its former self, a house that was full of secrets and dread, but completely empty of any real life. Some people in town figured the family was cursed to live in that twilight prison as payback for messing with something sacred. Others thought maybe they'd made a deal, trading their freedom for protection from some ancient evil that stalked the woods. But as new generations came and went, the house just got quieter and quieter. The last Fenmore heir disappeared back in 1973, leaving the mansion empty. But even now, locals will swear on their life that they see lights burning faintly after the sun goes down and shadows moving behind the windows that are all boarded up. What kind of force could hold a family captive for that long? And is there any way to break the curse, or is that darkness still hanging around, just waiting for the next family to make a mistake and cross its path? You know, it's one thing to hear the stories, but it's another to think about what that kind of life must have been like, day in and day out. After old Elias Fenmore came back from those woods, a changed man, the family's whole world got real small, real fast. That big, beautiful mansion turned into a fancier kind of prison, a cage they couldn't leave once the sun started to go down. Every single afternoon, as that light began to fade, they'd all get ready for their strange little ritual of survival. It was a whole production. They'd run around and yank all those heavy velvet curtains shut long before it was actually dusk outside. Every window got shuttered up tight, like they were battening down the hatches for a hurricane. Only this was a storm that came every single night. They'd snuff out all the lamps and lanterns, except for these specific clusters of candles they'd set up all over the house. They weren't just placed anywhere, neither. They were arranged in these weird, complicated patterns that looked like they meant something old and secret. Then the whole family would gather together in the biggest parlor. That room had a reputation, let me tell you. People said it used to be a private chapel a long time ago, and the air in there always felt different, thick. It was a silence that didn't feel empty, but heavy, like it was pressing right down on your skin. And outside, the rest of the world was just living its life. You could hear kids laughing as they ran home for supper, neighbors calling out to each other from their porches, but on the other side of the estate's big iron gates, it was like an invisible wall just dropped down, cutting the Fenmores off from the night completely. They were on their own island. This went on for years, and that one big rule was never, ever broken. Nobody was allowed to cross that threshold after sunset. The stories say that anyone who was dumb enough or brave enough to try it just vanished. Poof. Gone without a trace. There's this one tale about the oldest son, Thomas. They say he was a restless kid full of spirit. One evening, as twilight was settling in, he just up and decided to step out into the garden. He never came back inside. They searched for him come morning, but all they ever found was his lantern, lying shattered in a mess of thorny bushes. Living like that, trapped in that big dark house, it had to do something to a person. Time itself must have felt all warped inside those walls. Days and nights just blurred together under the sheer weight of all that fear. The family themselves, from what folks could glimpse, changed. They grew pale and fragile, their skin almost translucent from never feeling the sun or the night air on their faces. But their eyes, that's what people always mentioned. Their eyes burned with this haunted, intense look, like they were always watching something the rest of us couldn't see. And the things they did in the dark, that's where it gets real strange. It wasn't just about hiding. They had these rituals. There were chants, but not in any language anyone around here recognized. It sounded ancient, dead. They'd leave little offerings, strange little trinkets and such, on an old altar they kept down in the basement. And they wrote letters, page after page in this trembling handwriting that they'd seal up tight but never send. They just kept them, like they were preserving their secrets. From the outside, people would sometimes catch a fleeting glimpse of something. A figure pacing back and forth behind a frosted glass window. The flicker of candlelight throwing these big, grotesque shadows on the peeling wallpaper. Some even swore they heard a low hum, like some forgotten lullaby, echoing through the halls after the sun was gone. The Fenmore estate became a ghost of what it once was. It was a house that was alive with secrets and pure dread, but it was completely empty of any real, normal life. Some of the old-timers around here believed the family was cursed to live in that twilight prison as a punishment. They figured the Fenmores had disturbed something sacred out in those woods, and this was their penance. Others had a darker theory. They thought maybe the family had made a bargain with something, traded their freedom for protection from some ancient evil that roamed the woods when it got dark. They got safety, but the cost was their lives. But as the years turned into decades, the house just got quieter and quieter. The last Fenmore heir, a woman named Eleanor, she just disappeared in 1973. The mansion's been sitting empty ever since, but you ask anyone around here and they'll look you dead in the eye and swear that the lights still burn faintly inside after dusk and that you can see shadows moving behind all those boarded-up windows. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? What kind of power could hold a family captive for that long, through so many generations? And is there any way a curse like that can ever be broken? Or is that darkness still sitting there right now, just waiting, patient as can be, for the next unlucky soul to cross its path? Now, a house like that, sitting empty for so long, well, it was only a matter of time before folks got curious. A few years after the last Fenmore was gone, a local historian, a fellow with more guts than sense if you ask me, managed to get inside. He wasn't there for silver or trinkets. He was hunting for the truth. And in a locked study, hidden away behind a false wall, he found it. Dozens of old journals, their covers made of cracked leather, and the pages inside all yellowed and brittle with age. These were the private records of the Fenmore family, passed down from one generation to the next. They were never, ever meant for outsiders' eyes. What that historian read in those pages, well, it sent a chill straight down his spine. And he was a man who dealt in old, dead things for a living. Those journals gave a name to the shadow that came with the night. They called it the Watcher. It wasn't some random ghost or a spooky story. According to what Elias himself wrote, it was an ancient presence, something tied to the very land the Fenmores had built their mansion on. It was an entity, a force of nature with a mean streak, and it demanded two things: allegiance and sacrifice. The very first entries described Elias's expedition and the exact moment the curse took root. He wrote about a deep cave they found in the forest, its walls covered in symbols that were older than time itself. He and his men had stumbled right into it, disturbing something that was just slumbering there. They'd messed up big time, and without even knowing what they were doing, they'd made a pact, a blood for protection deal. The family was to stay inside the mansion after sunset, and every single night, they had to perform a ritual to keep this Watcher happy and at bay. If they failed, well, it meant death, or just disappearance. And not just for the Fenmores, but for anyone connected to them too. The later journals, written by his kids and grandkids, got into the real scary stuff, the things that happened inside the house. They wrote about hearing footsteps in hallways that were supposed to be empty. They talked about whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves, speaking in languages that had been dead for 1,000 years. They'd leave a book on a table, turn around and find it had moved on its own. One particularly sad entry talked about the mysterious disappearance of Thomas Fenmore, the son who'd broken the rules and stepped into the garden at dusk. The writings from that time on became more and more frantic, just a mess of scared thoughts and paranoid warnings to whoever was left, begging them to never ever cross the threshold once darkness fell. The very last journal in that stack just stops. It ends right in the middle of a sentence with a note that'll make your blood run cold. It said, "Tonight the shadows grow restless. The price may soon be due." Those journals are it. They're the only real, tangible proof that the Fenmore curse was more than just a local legend to scare kids around a campfire. It was a real, documented nightmare. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? What kind of dark power did Elias Fenmore actually wake up out there in those deep woods? And could those very same writings, the ones that detail all the horror, actually hold the secret key to breaking the whole terrible curse wide open? Now, if you were to ever get inside that old mansion, not that I'd recommend it, you'd see they left their mark everywhere. And I don't mean pictures on the wall, I'm talking about the symbols. They're carved into the wooden beams over your head, scratched into the door frames, and even hidden under layers of old peeling wallpaper. These aren't just random doodles or some kind of fancy decoration. They were the family's way of trying to talk, to protect themselves, and to keep a lid on something I don't think any of us can really understand. Those marks are creepy and cryptic, plain and simple. Some experts who got a look at pictures of them later on said they were a real disturbing mix of things. Ancient runes, occult sigils you might find in a witch's book, and tribal markings from folks who haven't been around for centuries. They figured each one was believed to have some kind of power over spirits, darkness, and all the things we can't see. There was one symbol that showed up more than any other, a kind of jagged circle with a single vertical line cutting right through it. You'd find that one over and over again, especially around the windows and the doorways. The thinking is that it was meant to be a ward, like a spiritual fence to block evil forces from getting in, or maybe from getting out. But here's the funny thing, it's a real paradox. Some of those symbols seem like they were meant to trap the family inside just as much as they were meant to protect them, like they were sealing the curse in place along with themselves. Elias Fenmore's own journals gave a few hints about this. He wrote that these symbols were like a language, a ritual code that had to be read and renewed every single evening before the sun was all the way down. According to his writings, if they failed to do it just right, they risked unleashing the Watcher itself. People living nearby would sometimes report seeing strange lights flickering behind those boarded-up windows, and they weren't just random lights. Folks said they were shaped like the symbols themselves, glowing with a faint, sickly light in the gathering dark. Some even claimed the whole house would hum softly, like it was charged with some otherworldly energy, right when the family was doing their nightly rites. There's one harrowing account from a woman who used to work there as a servant. She got out while she still could, and she never went back. But she said she once saw Elias Fenmore himself, tracing those symbols in the candlelight, chanting in a low voice, using words that made no sense at all. She said the air got so cold you could see your breath, and the shadows in the room didn't act right. She fled the house soon after and wouldn't ever talk about it again. So those carvings, in the end, were both a prison and a shield. They were the only thing keeping the Fenmores alive, but they were also the very bars that kept them imprisoned by their own fear and that curse's unyielding grip. But it sure makes you think, were the Fenmores really protecting themselves from some outside evil? Or after all that time, after all those rituals, had they somehow become a part of it themselves? And what would happen if someone were to come along and destroy those symbols? Would it finally break the curse and set whatever's left of them free? Or would it just doom whoever was dumb enough to try? You didn't have to live around here long to hear about the disappearances. The Fenmore family's one rule was simple, but it was absolute. Nobody steps outside after sunset. But over all those decades, that rule got broken a few times, and let me tell you, the consequences were nothing short of terrifying. The most famous case, the one everyone still talks about, was Thomas Fenmore, Elias's eldest son. This was back in the late 1920s. The story goes that he was a young man, probably full of rebellion or maybe just a desperate kind of cabin fever. One evening, as twilight was creeping across the property, he just stepped out into the garden. Neighbors on nearby farms later told the sheriff they heard a single blood-curdling scream rip through the night, followed by this eerie, total silence that felt heavier than the dark itself. When the sun came up, Thomas was gone, just vanished. They found his lantern shattered into 100 pieces near a thorny bush, but there were no footprints leading away. It was like the ground itself had swallowed him up. After that, the family never spoke his name again. It was like they were trying to erase him, hoping that if they pretended he never existed, maybe they could erase the horror that took him. But Thomas wasn't the only one. Over the years, other members of the Fenmore family, and even a few servants who must have thought the stories were nonsense, mysteriously vanished right around sunset. Some of them left behind these cryptic notes that didn't make any sense. Others just faded from existence, like they were swallowed whole by the encroaching darkness. People in town started whispering about strange things. They talk about weird lights flickering in the windows, shadows moving behind the curtains when nobody should be home, and some even claimed to hear faint voices calling out from the estate grounds late at night. The rumors started to say that the house itself had become a trap, a kind of in-between space, stuck halfway between our world and something far older and far darker. The folks who defied the curse, they paid for it with their lives, or maybe with their very souls. And yet, through all these awful disappearances, the Fenmores who were left never once packed up and abandoned their nightly rituals. They were bound by something tighter than chains, pure fear, and a twisted sense of loyalty. You know, even though the Fenmore family themselves were too scared to cross their own property line after dark, that didn't mean the rest of the world stayed away. That estate became a beacon for the strange and the unexplained. And for decades, folks living nearby swapped some pretty chilling tales about what they saw and heard lurking around that mansion once the sun went down. It was like the curse didn't just live inside the house. Its reach stretched out past those gates. One of the most detailed stories came from a farmer named Jacob Harrow, a real salt-of-the-earth type whose land backed right up to the Fenmore property. Jacob wasn't a man given to flights of fancy or ghost stories. If he couldn't touch it or mend it, he usually didn't believe in it. But even he couldn't explain what he saw one autumn evening back in 1943. He was out working late in his fields when he noticed a strange light coming from one of the mansion's top windows. It wasn't the warm, steady glow of a candle or lamp. This thing pulsed, kind of like a sick heartbeat, all erratic and unnatural. Curiosity got the better of him, and he started walking a little closer. As the last bit of dusk gave way to full night, the air around him turned ice-cold real sudden, a deep chill that bit right through his jacket. Then the ground under his feet started to vibrate, just a faint hum at first. The shadows cast by the old trees began to twist and stretch out, forming shapes that just weren't right. Shapes that legs and arms shouldn't make. That's when he saw them. Figures. They were vague and kind of shifty, not quite solid, but not exactly see-through either. They weren't fully human, but they weren't animal either. They just lingered right beyond the mansion's main gates. Jacob said he could hear whispered voices carried on the wind, voices speaking in languages he'd never heard, repeating names that sounded ancient and forgotten. When he tried to take another step closer, an invisible force just pushed him back, plain as day, making him stumble. He swore up and down that he saw a silhouette in one of the windows just watching him, and its eyes were glowing with this eerie, pale light. Stories like Jacob's weren't one-offs. Over the years, hunters, wanderers, and even a few brave or foolish paranormal investigators reported similar things near the estate after dark. Some heard mournful cries echoing through the woods that surrounded the place. Others caught fleeting glimpses of figures pacing the halls behind the curtains. One investigator, a woman named Elise Monroe, even recorded audio out there. Her tapes captured low, guttural chanting and these unsettling harmonic sounds like a messed-up choir when she got too close to the property line. She claimed she saw symbols made of light, just like the ones carved inside the house, floating in the air around the estate, pulsing with a sinister energy. The Fenmore mansion had become more than just a home. It was a nexus, a focal point where the veil between our world and something else got real thin. The curse that bound the family also attracted something ancient and malevolent, something that seemed to feed on the fear and the trapped souls inside. People started talking in hushed tones about the watcher in the dark, the presence tied to the estate that demanded obedience. It wasn't just a story to them anymore, it was a warning. You'd think after all that, the Fenmore name would have just faded away into nothing, wouldn't you? But that's not how these things work. By the time the middle of the 20th century rolled around, the Fenmore family had become less of a real family and more of a ghost story folks told each other. The name was something you'd say in a hushed voice, tied to a house that just flat out refused to let its people go. The estate itself, once so grand and full of life, just sat there, weathering and darkening with every passing season. Its windows were all boarded up, and the grounds around it grew wild and tangled. The last known Fenmore was a woman named Eleanor. She was as reclusive as they come, a ghost in her own right. And just like her ancestors, she never ever left that mansion after the sun went down. From what little we can piece together, she kept up with all those ancient rituals all by herself, trying to maintain that fragile balance between her family and the curse that was eating them alive. Folks living nearby would sometimes hear things. The faint flicker of candlelight burning late into the night, soft chanting that would drift on the wind, and every once in a while the sound of someone sobbing, a lonely, broken sound coming from deep inside that house. Then one autumn evening in 1973, it all just stopped. The lights that usually flickered didn't. The house went completely, utterly silent for the first time in over 70 years. It was a silence that felt heavier and more wrong than any of the noises that came before it. After a few weeks of this dead quiet, the local authorities finally got up the nerve to go inside. What they found was a mansion that was just abandoned. There was no sign of Eleanor Fenmore, no sign of any family members, no sign of a struggle or any violence. The rooms were all untouched, like someone had just gotten up and walked away in the middle of their day. Candles were burned down to nothing but stubs. Journals were lying open on desks, their pages all stained and torn. The only thing they found in abundance was this overwhelming sense of unease, like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Her disappearance got people talking all over again. Some liked to think that Eleanor had finally found a way to break the curse and just escaped, finally free of that miserable prison. Others, and I think this is probably closer to the truth, were afraid that the darkness that had haunted her family for generations had finally come to collect its last payment. It had finally consumed her. Since that day, no one with the name Fenmore has ever been seen around here again. But the mansion itself is still standing, a crumbling monument to a family's tragic legacy. And even now, locals will swear they see strange lights flickering in the windows at night. They'll talk about shadows moving behind the boarded-up panes and whispers that seem to ride the wind itself. The Fenmore estate is just frozen in time, a silent witness to a curse that might never, ever be lifted. So what really happened to Eleanor? Did she finally find her freedom, or was she consumed by the very darkness she spent her whole life trying to contain? Well, sir, the Fenmore curse, as you might have guessed, didn't just up and vanish when the family did. For decades after they were gone, all sorts of folks, locals, occultists, and just plain curious investigators, tried to uncover the real truth. Some even tried to break that dark pact that held the family captive for so long. Every single one of those attempts, and I've read about most of them, tells you two things: just how deep the Fenmore family's plight really was, and the downright terrifying consequences of meddling with forces that are way beyond our understanding. One of the first big tries happened back in the 1950s. A group of local occultists, led by a fella named Father Malcolm Crane, decided they were going to go in there and perform a cleansing ritual. Their idea was that if they could destroy those symbols and recite some ancient prayers, they could cut the curse's hold right at the root. Well, they started their work at twilight, which was exactly the time the curse was at its most powerful. They were in there chanting their invocations, trying to scrub those cryptic marks off the walls. But as full darkness settled in, the whole feeling of the place changed in a heartbeat. The air went icy cold, the shadows got deeper and just plain wrong, and the house itself seemed to breathe with a kind of sinister life. People watching from outside said the ritualists met with some violent resistance. Windows shattered for no reason, doors slammed shut on their own, and an unseen force slammed them right into the walls. They were scared out of their minds, completely disoriented, and they fled, leaving the mansion and its curse just as they found it. In the years that followed, a few individuals took a more personal approach. A private investigator named Carl Reeves decided his plan was to spend a full night inside the estate. He brought cameras and audio recorders to document the whole thing. He later reported hearing anguished screams, seeing ghostly figures drifting through the halls, and feeling this oppressive presence that got heavier and heavier as midnight got closer. His recordings, what's left of them anyway, are mostly lost or corrupted now, but the pieces that remain hint at something terrifying lurking in those walls, a malevolent consciousness that's tied directly to the curse itself. In more recent years, urban explorers who've snuck in always tell the same kind of stories. They end up leaving in a real hurry after they get the feeling of unseen eyes watching their every move, or they hear whispered warnings telling them not to disturb the family's resting place. But one of the most chilling tales has to be about a woman named Sarah, who was supposedly a descendant of the Fenmore family. She came back in the early 2000s, determined to end the curse for good. She had her ancestors' journals and all the knowledge of the rituals. She planned a whole ceremony to undo the original pact. Her last contact with the outside world was a frantic phone call. She was reporting strange noises and shadowy figures getting closer. And then, nothing. She was never seen or heard from again. You see, the shadow of their curse, it stretches long, even into the present day. That mansion stands out there as a decaying relic, a symbol of the unknown horrors that used to call its halls home. But even with the place abandoned and shut up tight, the stories about the Fenmore's dark legacy just refuse to die. These days, the old estate draws in paranormal investigators, thrill seekers, and historians, each one hoping to uncover a piece of the truth, or maybe just catch a glimpse of the supernatural forces everyone says still linger there. Folks around here still tell their chilling tales. Some talk about driving past the mansion late at night and their headlights catching a flicker of candlelight in an upstairs window, or ghostly figures silently watching from behind a cracked pane of glass. Others mention the sudden, shocking drop in temperature you feel when you get near the property line, an icy chill that feels like it reaches right into your soul. I even heard about one woman, a descendant of the bloodline named Claire, who came forward not too long ago. She claimed she could feel the curse's pull, like a tug on her heart. She said she had these strange dreams that haunted her nights, visions of the mansion, flickering shadows, and a voice that kept calling her back. She confessed to a deep, powerful fear that the curse might never truly be broken, that it runs through her veins like poison. Claire's story fits right in with what a lot of folks in occult circles believe, that curses tied to bloodlines can be escaped easy. They become a part of the family's very essence, passed down through the generations like some terrible inheritance. And it's not just ghost stories either. The Fenmore estate has inspired all sorts of legends and works of fiction, fueling the imaginations of anyone fascinated by haunted houses and family curses. The estate's history is a grim reminder, a warning about the cost of secrets that get buried too deep and the real dangers of poking at forces that are best left alone. But I think the most unsettling truth of it all is this: the Fenmore curse was never just about that one family or that one house. It's about the darkness that waits for every single one of us, the shadow that lurks just past the edge of the light, ready to claim anyone who's foolish enough to step into the unknown. As long as that mansion keeps standing, the Fenmore story will be a chilling testament to fear, to loyalty, and to the terrible price you pay when you disturb powers that were ancient before we were ever born.